Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Welcome, dear listener, to Fear from the Heartland. I'm your host, Paul J. McSorley. Set aside some moments now and take an adventurous ride on a journey into the psyche of some talented writers. They will dig into your being and titillate you. Oh, I love that word, titillate. While the stories may not all take place in the Heartland, I am delivering them to you from the Heartland. My intention is to strike fear and confusion into the mind, soul, and yes, the heart. This is Fear from the Heartland. Hello, Heartlanders, and welcome to episode 14 of Fear from the Heartland. I'm your host, Paul J. McSorley. Hey, Dad, wouldn't you like to just spend an hour inside my mind? Hell no, you're out there, son. In fact, you're so damn weird, I'm not sure I'd get out. He took it as a compliment. I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I would have too. I honestly have gotten into our author's mind for tonight. I've had the honor of narrating 2 epic sci-fi fantasy novels of his, as well as numerous stories here on Fear from the Heartland and Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. We are featuring 2 of his tales tonight, and with caution, I compel you to have a lifeline ready. You are entering Heath Pfaff's mind. No guarantees you are coming back. Let's get after it. Brian's dream home was the culmination of his hard work and determination, a place where he hoped to raise a family and spend time with his friends. But those dreams faltered when his wife and daughter stepped through a closet on the 2nd floor of the house and into a cave that had no right existing. Now it's up to Brian and his friends to try and find the lost women before something terrible happens. And now, for your indulgence, The Lost, The Cave, and the Closet. I don't want the cops up here snooping in my stuff. Brian's voice told me he was angry almost as much as he was worried. Things were out of his control, and he never liked that. Your wife and daughter are missing. Now isn't the best time to worry about the cops finding your little grow operation, Brian. Quinn at least was making some sense. We'd been friends for a long time, since kindergarten, and the dynamic really hadn't changed much over the years. Growing up and getting married hadn't made any of us better at not being idiots. Brian was a hothead who got himself, and us, in trouble, but also managed to get us into some great adventures. Quinn was smart and direct, but he didn't quite have the personality to pull the group in less destructive directions. Thomas was quiet and just went along with whatever the rest of us decided was the best course of action. He was dependable, though. I was the one who tried to make whatever plan we ended up with actually work, and usually managed to get us out of the worst of the trouble. Brian scowled at Quinn. You know your uncle's got it out for me? He comes up here and sees the plants in the back and he'll finally be able to bust me. No cops. The 2 plants in Brian's backyard were barely knee-high and were almost dead. I didn't think anyone was going to seriously give him trouble over them. Brian went on. I just need some quick help. Besides, I don't know how to explain this to the cops. About that, explain this to me again? I decided it was time for clarification. You woke up and saw Heather chasing Alice into the closet. And when you went in to check the closet, there was a tunnel instead of a closet on the 2nd floor. That's what you said, right? Brian nodded, clearly exasperated. I fucking know it sounds crazy. That's why I called you guys. Because No one else is going to believe this shit. I don't believe this shit. Quinn helped. Brian looked like he was about to explode, but Tom spoke up, drawing all of our attention. Why don't we go have a look? Because Brian is fucking with us, and he's going to have Heather jump out of the closet with a mask on, and I'm too tired for this shit. Quinn wasn't having any of it. I looked at Brian, and I could see the tension in him. This wasn't pulling a prank, Brian. This was something bad just happened, Brian. It was like the time he had come to us after his parents were killed in that car accident a few years back. He was brittle, the pain just under the surface. We're here, I said. Let's go have a look. We exchanged looks and everyone nodded, even Quinn, so we started inside. Did you try to go after them? Quinn asked as we started up the stairs, meaning he was taking this far more seriously than he was letting on. He could sense Brian's mood as well. We had been together for almost 40 years. You knew people after that kind of time. These weren't just my friends, they were my brothers, the ones I had chosen as family. I started to, but I realized pretty quickly it was getting dark and I didn't have gear. I didn't want to run into the dark and get lost, Brian answered. This was his brand new house. The stairs didn't even squeak as we walked up them. He'd only been moved in for just over a month. We reached the master bedroom and went inside, turning in the direction of the closet. According to logical reasoning, the closet should have been up against the back corner of the house's wall on the second floor. As we turned on our headlamps and stepped in to look, we quickly realized that logical reasoning would need to be put on hold. This is impossible, Thomas said softly, and he was right. We were staring down a narrow cave, gray stone walls all around. They looked natural, like they had just been carved by water over time. They were about 6 feet wide and about the same tall, the corners rounded so it was a circle and not a square-cut passage. My light went down the path until it couldn't get any further, and there was only darkness to see. Had this path actually existed, it would have gone right out the back of the house and extended past the edge of Brian's yard, about 14 feet above the ground. There was a picture scratched on the wall just inside the cave, a spiral with a pointed tip at the outer end, a diamond-shaped head. I reached out to touch it, wondering who had scratched it there, but Quinn's voice snapped my focus away. Shit, we should really call the police, Quinn reiterated. I don't even know what this is. Guys, please, Heather and Alice are down there somewhere. I need to find them. Brian's voice was as sincere as it had ever been. Who could say no to that? Thomas stepped into the cave and started walking. He didn't say anything at all, but he didn't need to. We were here for Brian, for the love of his life and the little girl we all considered a niece. There was no question of whether or not we'd keep going. Brian followed after Thomas, and then Quinn entered the cave and I took up position in the back. 1 second, guys, I called ahead, my voice sounding too close in the relatively narrow space. I pulled out my knife, and using the glass breaker on the heel of the handle, I scratched an arrow pointing back towards the door. It was kind of unnecessary at this point, but I wanted to make a habit of doing it. I didn't want to get lost in whatever this place was. All right, let's go, I said, and then we were moving again. At 6'2", Thomas had to walk at a slight hunch, but the rest of us were just short enough not to have that problem. Every few hundred steps, we stopped and called out for the girls, then waited and listened, hoping for an answer. How far could they have gone? Trying to keep track of distance was pointless because the cave didn't seem to change in any noticeable way. Not at first. It wasn't until I looked back over my shoulder and discovered that I couldn't see the entrance at all anymore, that I realized it had been very slowly curving. I stopped and marked the wall again. The cave is turning, I said, and the others stopped to look back as well. I went down to a knee so they could look back the way we had come. Can you see anything up ahead? There is something up there, but it doesn't look like a person. It might be a split in the tunnel, Thomas said. Quinn cursed loudly. A split? How are we going to handle that? I mean, it would be logical to split up, but I'm not sure I like that idea. Before we worry about it, let's make sure it is a split, Brian interjected. We have to keep going anyway. We can't go back until we find the girls." He said this last part as though reminding us that he didn't intend to turn back. I didn't think any of us were going to turn back now. We'd already gone too far. There was a general murmur of acceptance among the group, and we began to move forward again. I looked up at the rock overhead as we moved, and I noticed that it looked like there were gouges in the ceiling, spaced out in a strange, even pattern to the left and right of center, but not in the center. I wondered if it was related to what produced the tunnel, but then again, the tunnel was already impossible. Why did anything have to have produced it? Maybe it just was. We stopped after about 30 more yards. I couldn't see much around the other guys, but I tried to look anyway. "It splits," Thomas said. "As far as I can see, the two new tunnels run right beside each other, but I can't see the end of either branch." "Can you see any evidence of Heather and Alice?" Brian asked. "I mean, they must have gone down the same side." "I'm sorry, Brian, they both look exactly alike." Just as Tom finished talking, a terrible cacophony of sound rushed down the tunnel, enveloping all of us in chaos for several moments until it stuttered out entirely. "What the fuck was that?" The words were out of my mouth before the ringing in my ears was gone. "Did it sound like a person?" Brian's voice held an edge of barely restrained panic. No, that wasn't a person, Bri." Quinn reached up and squeezed Brian's shoulder. Whatever it had been, it had sounded alive, but Quinn was right to the degree that I didn't think it had sounded remotely human. When I was a young man, our barn had been struck by lightning during a big summer storm. By the time we had realized what had happened, the building was engulfed, as was the livestock inside. We managed to get some of the animals out, but I never forgot the sound of the dying ones we couldn't get to, screaming in abject terror. It was a primal sound, one so drenched in fear and pain that it defied my young mind's ability to understand. I knew only that hearing that suffering had given me nightmares that I still sometimes suffered from. The sound I had just heard in the cave was like that in a way, primal and full of a type of pain that I couldn't comprehend. For the first time since we had entered the cave, I wasn't sure that I could go any further. "Which tunnel did it come down?" Tom was asking, and Brian said something in response, but I was looking back over my shoulder at the way we'd come. "Maybe we should get help," I said quietly. "This whole thing is getting really freaky." "No, guys, come on. We'll split up here, go a little way down these next two passages, and if there's still nothing, then we can call for help, all right?" Brian was pleading, his voice quavering in a way I'd never heard from him. "Shit. All right, yeah, let's look a little further," I agreed. "Everyone got their phones?" I asked, pulling mine from my pocket. It was reading no signal, but the time was still right. The others pulled out their phones as well, everyone checking the signal as though they expected this magic cave in the back of Brian's house to have reception. Not having reception was one of the least surprising things I had seen since we found the hole. "We'll split into two groups and walk about 10 minutes down the next branch, and then we'll come back here and report what we find, all right? So we meet here in 20 minutes, okay?" I looked at the others as well as I could in the cramped tunnel. Brian was nodding, his phone down at his side. I wasn't convinced he'd come back so easily. 20 minutes so we can see what the other group found, right?" I reiterated, trying to get Brian to meet my eyes. If he didn't find anything, surely he'd want to know if we had. "Yeah, 20 minutes, 10 out, 10 back," Quinn confirmed. "Let's get this done with. Brian and Tom can take the right path. We'll take the left." He gestured at the tunnel that was going to be our course. I took a moment and marked the path back. We moved out together then. I felt a sense of impending danger as our group broke apart. For a short while, I could hear Brian and Tom talking as they went down the right path. Tom was trying to comfort Brian, but after less than a minute, the voices faded entirely. "I hate this," Quinn said quietly as we walked. "Nothing about this is right. I'd do anything for the girls, but I'm fucking terrified." "Yeah, I know," I answered. "I feel exactly the same. I want to help, but I think we need to get some people with real equipment down here. Safety lines or tunnel lights, something." Quinn nodded his agreement and then added a moment later, "Hey, are the walls getting closer or is it just me?" At some point, I'd started to walk partially sideways without noticing. Quinn was right. The walls were getting closer together. Maybe this branch of the cave is coming to an end? I offered, hopeful at the idea that we might be able to turn around before our time was up. I checked my phone. It had only been 2 minutes. Shit, it's narrowing faster, Quinn said, and then a few moments later we stopped. I tried to see over his shoulder, but I couldn't make out much. What is it? I asked. Well, the path is still here, but it's really narrow. There's like a slit in the rock here. I'm not sure I can get through it. Quinn muttered something quietly to himself that sounded like, I'm not sure I should try. I looked at my phone again. 3 minutes. We should try to get through. If you start to get stuck, I'll help pull you back out, I told Quinn, not liking the words even as I said them. This whole evening felt like a litany of mistakes. Quinn grunted, seeming uncertain. All right. Fuck. All right. He turned sideways and I caught a glimpse of the shallow slit in the tunnel. He was right. It was going to be a tight fit, but it did look possible. Without any further hesitation, Quinn began to push himself into the passage. In a few seconds, he was most of the way inside, and I could see the sweat on his head. I can see the other side. His words came out between shallow, fast breaths. It opens up again. He followed this up with another groan as he pushed himself in further. There were another few moments of this, and then I heard him stagger out the other side. I'm through, he called back to me. The tunnel goes on from here. It's wider again. Come on. I felt a surge of despair and realized that I'd been hoping he'd find this was a dead end and we could head back. I'm coming, I called through to him, and then it was my turn to get moving. I pushed myself into the wedge of space. I had to pull in a breath to fit my ribs, and my gut dragged against the stone. I needed to get back in shape. The wall in front of me was just an inch from my nose. I tried to take in a deep breath in a moment of panic as I realized that I couldn't fill my lungs from inside the gap. I'd never had trouble with enclosed spaces before, but suddenly I was feeling a surge of panic. I pushed myself harder, using my hands to grab the stone in front of me to pull me forward. Fucking tight in here, I spoke to try and keep my panic in check. Just push through a little more, you'll be okay, Quinn said, and then his hand was on mine, helping to pull me through the gap. I let out a nervous laugh and let him pull me. I was almost there. I felt something in the walls, like a vibration that traveled from the stone and into me. Less than a second later, that horrible sound from before rang through the tunnel. My ears hummed as I let go of Quinn and reached up to try and cover them. I couldn't manage in the confined space, and I had to just suffer through the shrieking horror. When it finally died down, there was still a humming in my ears. Was that louder than the first time? I asked, back to work pushing myself through the slot. One more hard drag and I popped out the other side of the gap. I looked around. The tunnel was empty. Quinn? I could see fairly far down the tunnel, but I couldn't see my friend. He had just had my hand. There had only been seconds between when I had last had his hand and when I emerged from the narrow section of cave. Even if he was running, he wouldn't be able to get out of sight that quickly. Panic was starting to set in. I pulled out my phone and looked at the time. 6 minutes. It had taken 3 minutes for us to get through the crack in the wall. I'd agreed to search for 10 minutes, but now Quinn was gone and I had the narrow gap between me and the way back. Steady, steady, we've got this, I said to myself, my voice too near. I turned around and looked back at the gap. Right next to it was an arrow on the wall pointing at the gap. I froze for a moment. The number 147 was scrawled over and over around it. What did that mean? Had Quinn done this? The arrow looked just like the ones I'd been making, more of a V than an actual arrow. Why would Quinn do this? What was the alternative? I was panicking. I knew that I needed to remain calm, but I was having trouble thinking clearly. This place was too strange, and I was too afraid. Quinn! I shouted as loudly as I could, actually hurting my throat. My voice faded quickly. No! The voice had echoed back down through the darkness wasn't Quinn's. It wasn't a voice I'd ever heard before. Fear drove me back to the gap in the rock. I slammed myself into the narrow opening with reckless abandon, not bothering to worry about how tight the fit was or how abrasive the rock felt as it tore at my shirt and pants. I felt my skin abrade on my knuckles and on my too wide belly, but it all seemed secondary to the terror that kept me moving. I was looking back down the tunnel that I was now leaving, my head stuck to the side in places as I crawled through the space, and from deep down in the darkness of the cave, 2 lights reflected back at me. I lived in the country. I knew what it was like to catch a deer in a flashlight or to see your neighbor's cat looking down from a rooftop with those reflective shining eyes, but this was something else entirely. I had the distinct feeling that there were no cats in these caves, and I doubted there were deer wandering through them either. Whatever was looking back at me, it didn't belong there. Come on through. Quinn's voice echoed down the tunnel towards me, but it was broken and disjointed. My imagination was trying to put together the figure that matched those eyes and matched that voice that was both Quinn's and not Quinn's, and it wouldn't settle on anything remotely human. The eyes were too wide apart, the voice too stilted and sharp. My light reflected off something horrifying. I thought it was a man with a metal pole piercing through his body, the top erupting from his open mouth and forcing his head backwards. Its throat was torn open, and there was a mess of leather, metal, and human muscle connected to some strange device. Come on through. It croaked in a sharky clone of Quinn's voice. It sounded almost like Quinn's voice being played as a rotting instrument. It was at that moment that I fell backwards through the gap and crashed to the ground on the opposite side of the narrow passage. I hadn't even realized I had been making progress. I looked back at that narrow channel, expecting to see the monster thing closer now, ready to stretch itself impossibly thin so that it could get a hold of me and do whatever it had done to Quinn to me. But I couldn't see anything now. I got back to my feet and started down the tunnel. I was a few feet down when I saw an arrow etched on the wall. I stopped in place and looked at it. It was one of mine. Or it should have been. It looked just like it, but it was pointing back the way I'd just come. No, that's not possible, I said quietly to myself. There was only one branch in the cave, and there was no way I'd gotten turned around. I hadn't even marked a place along this area, had I? I ignored it and kept going. I'd have to reach the split soon, and then I could wait for the others, and we could get the fuck out of here and call for some help. Quinn needed help now, too. We all did. I traveled on for another minute or so and came across a slipper laying in the middle of the cave. I knelt down and picked it up. It was a woman's slipper, probably Heather's, but I hadn't seen it on the initial pass through this cave. There was no way both Quinn and I would miss something so obvious. I stood back up and came level with the handwritten message. I recognized the scrawl as mine. Stay inside. Don't leave the cave. It was in big letters, and the words were underlined. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my knife, turning it over in my hand. I still had it. No one else had taken it and started scrawling things on the wall. So where did these other things come from? I put the knife away, but my hands were shaking. I started walking again. There had to be some explanation, some reasoning behind all of this. If I wasn't in pain from scraping through the narrow tunnel earlier, I might have thought it was a dream. But everything was too real. There was a crisp focus to the madness that made it impossible to ignore. A few steps later, I put my foot down in a puddle of thick red liquid that I immediately knew was blood. It might have been any number of other things, but I knew it wasn't. My breathing was getting frantic and fast. I had to make myself slow down. Who was bleeding? I followed the path, the steady trickle of blood. It was so heavy. If I was following a deer, I'd be expecting to find its corpse soon enough. They're all dead if you leave. The words were in massive letters down one side of the tunnel, and I had to split my attention between them and the blood on the floor. The result was that I almost tripped over the body laying in the middle of the hall. I recognized it immediately. Thomas? He was so still, but for some reason I still knelt down next to him and tried to shake him. Tom, buddy, you okay? My voice was a harsh whisper. I shook him harder and then finally grabbed his shoulder and with considerable effort flipped him over. My stomach immediately turned and I ran back a few steps and lost the contents of my stomach. It was Tom, but most of his face was gone. It looked like something had reached in and taken a handful out of the front of his skull. His brain was visible and in solid enough condition that I thought it was likely he had walked down the tunnel with his body ruined like it was for some time before finally dying from blood loss. Tom's dead. Brian's voice swept out of the dark towards me. Oh, God. Tom's dead. The voice was wet and gravelly. It wasn't Brian, even if it sort of sounded like him. Looking back down the hall, I saw a brief flicker of reflective light, and that was all I needed to send me running. I didn't know where I was going. I hoped the tunnel would take me back to the house, but I had no way of knowing. I'd never passed the split in the path, or I hadn't noticed. The arrows and the writing on the walls made no sense, and then it was there in front of me. Light. I could see the tunnel exit. I ran as hard as I ever had in my life and burst out into the house so fast that I crashed to the ground, slid across the floor, and slammed into the doorway to Brian's room. As I was righting myself, I heard a voice behind me, one that was strange and familiar at the same time. You shouldn't have come out here. You should have listened to the walls. I turned to face the speaker and nearly fainted. It was me. It looked just like me, but it was all covered in blood, and there was a handcuff hanging from one wrist. I looked down at myself, expecting to see the other me do the same because it had to be a reflection. I was covered in blood now, but why? A door slammed and I looked up to see the closet had been closed, but it was something caught out of the periphery of my vision that gave me pause. I turned my head. The dead bodies were splayed out across the floor, bed, and walls as though each had been expertly butchered. They were all there. Brian, Quinn, Thomas, Heather, and even little Alice. They had been taken apart like an engine that was to be cleaned and rebuilt. No, the word fell out of my mouth. No, this is... I pulled my phone from my pocket and with shaking hands, dialed 911. Well, Heartlanders, The Lost, the Cave, and the Closet by master storyteller Heath Pfaff was a crazy ride. But what if I told you this next tale will give you clarity, or provide you with more questions? Please, you decide. The vast majority of people get to go through their lives without knowing that something terrible lurks just beneath the thin veneer of normality they encounter on a daily basis. Sometimes reality gets thin, worn down, and when it does, dark things come crawling through the gaps. The uncanny man is watching and waiting for a chance to twist our fragile reality into the design of his endless animosity. There is no escape from the dark once it has a taste of you. And now for your indulgence, Anomaly. The first reported incident was an alleged homicide in which a man killed 5 people in the master bedroom, dissected them in a meticulous fashion, and vanished with the lungs, vocal cord, and epiglottis of all 5 of the 5 victims. The killer, a man named James Jones, was originally apprehended at the site, but escaped during his arrest and has not been seen since. William Sunderland was reading from the file as we approached the site of the latest anomaly. We had all read the manuscript on our own, but this final part of the mission briefing was a tradition at this point. He continued. The second incident happened 3 years later. A family, the Ventellis, from out of town, bought the O'Keene residence from the bank that had taken custody after the passing of the original owner and his wife. Due to the secluded area and the nature of small-town gossip, the property had sat empty and unmonitored over those interim years, so we have very few incident reports from that time frame. Nothing more substantial than reports of lights in windows. William cleared his throat. 7 months after moving into the house, the new residents made a call to the local police, saying that they had heard someone in their home while they were sleeping. The police came out to investigate, but couldn't find any evidence of things being amiss. They decided the noise was raccoons on the roof, filed the report, and forgot about it. But over the course of the next 3 weeks, the Ventelli family would make 10 more reports covering everything from strange noises to sightings of figures moving about inside the house at night. Not sure what to make of things, but suspecting that the Ventelli family was looking to try and cash in on the history of the property, the police agreed to send out a cruiser to watch over the house at night for a while, not expecting anything to come of it. The first night of monitoring was silent. The officer on duty saw nothing, and the Ventellis didn't report anything amiss. The second night was a different matter. At around 1 a.m. on the second night of surveillance, the officer keeping watch on the house saw someone moving through the rooms of the first floor of the house. As part of the surveillance process, the Ventellis were not to go anywhere without switching on lights so that they could be seen from outside, and to differentiate them from any hostile third parties. The officer figured that someone had forgotten the rules or was just trying to get him worked up, but he still called in the sighting and then went to investigate. While on his way to the house, he saw another person moving in a window on the first floor of the house. He called this in and reported, "He's got a spear or a pole." The officer was asked if he wanted backup, and he responded that he did, and that was the last communication from the officer. When backup arrived in the form of 2 state troopers and another local officer, they searched the outside looking for their man but couldn't find him. The door at the front of the house was open, so they proceeded inside and scanned the house room by room. They didn't find anyone. They never found anyone. Later that night, 2 forensic specialists went missing in the house, and that was when we were told about the incidents on the property. The higher-ups at Gatehouse decided that this sounded like it might be in our jurisdiction, so they bought the house and the land around it. It has been 3 months since acquisition, and we'll be the first agents on scene. Any questions? It's not verified to be anomalous yet, then? We could be dealing with a serial killer or some natural phenomenon, Rick asked, his glasses hanging off the tip of his nose as was normal for him. I didn't know how he could see anything like that. They weren't reading glasses. The man was very nearsighted. Despite finding his lack of proper spectacle etiquette annoying, Rick was actually easy to like. He was a little strange at times, but a nice guy. No, it is not, but the details of the disappearances are enough like other reported anomalies that we have rated this site as hot, which is why we've come with gear, William answered, nodding at the black hard cases of supplies we had brought along with us. We want to set up our test instruments inside the house and then head out to a safe distance and observe. We're assuming this anomaly will work like the others we found and will stay confined to the space inside the house. It was a strange thing about anomalies, but they tended to find borders and keep to them. I had personally been to a cave with an anomaly, a couple of other houses, and one field that was surrounded by an old barbed wire fence, and that was only a few of my jobs. In each case, the anomalous activity seemed to randomly select some otherwise inconspicuous boundary and hold to it. That was just one of a million things we didn't understand about these events. Other than the reports of shadows, is there any indication of physical manifestations inside the property? Chip was one of our armed recon escorts. He was smart, fast, and great with a rifle. I'd been on 3 missions with him so far, and he had always been on top of any threats that cropped up. We're not sure what happened to the 5 people who were slaughtered in the first incident, but we know from reports that the man who was deemed responsible claimed to have nothing to do with the deaths. You know as well as I do that the things that come out of anomalies are never nice. I think it's safe to assume that these things can physically manifest. His grim expression was mirrored in the face of all of us. The things we saw in the line of duty could never be forgotten. It's better to assume the worst in these kinds of situations, he added darkly. The file said we're doing cleanup if the site is active. Are we expecting this to be a simple research and raise operation? Lori sounded calm and focused. We had worked 5 missions together, more than anyone else on the team, and she was the steadiest person I knew. She had a PhD in particle physics, another in anthropology with a specialization in occult histories, and a third in chemistry with a specialization in non-terrestrial elements. She also held master's degrees in astrobiology and data analytics. To top it off, she was ex-military and could knock a flea off the ass of a dog with the custom 9mm she carried on her hip. You know what I think about those. William seemed to expect this question because he had his reply all planned out. Trust me, your reports have been handed to the appropriate parties, but the consensus is that the history of successful anomaly closures outweighs the risk of theoretical complications, so we'll be gathering as much data as we safely can and then burning everything down. The van dropped over a steep hill and I felt an unpleasant lurching in my stomach that stuck with me even after the vehicle had settled again. Great. One more reason to feel terrible, I thought to myself. I wasn't sure where I stood on the closure issue. So far, studying and then destroying the sites had shut down all of the anomalies we'd encountered, with the exception of the sinkhole at Site 73 and the cabin at Site 8. Site 73 refused to be closed. No matter what was placed over the opening of the sinkhole, the material degraded and collapsed within a few hours. Additionally, those responsible for attempting to block the sinkhole often became violently and sometimes fatally sick. The cabin at Site 8 rebuilt itself. We tried knocking it down with bulldozers, blowing it up with C4, burning it to the ground, dropping explosives on it, removing the building in its entirety from the property, and encasing the whole thing in molten aluminum. The cabin always returned unharmed, and there was never any witness to how it happened. People left to observe fell asleep, cameras crackled out, drones fell out of the sky. An entire group of 100 armed men marched out of the woods in a trance and couldn't remember why. In the cases of these unbreakable anomalies, we simply bought up the land and set up a perimeter. It was the most you could do. Any other questions? William looked at each of us. We hadn't heard from Shauna or Clay, but the file didn't leave a lot of room for questions. Shauna was our second armed recon. I hadn't been on a mission with her before, but I knew she was experienced. Clay was the newest member of the current team, but even he had been out to 4 sites. I was glad to be running with experienced people. Everyone had to get their feet wet somehow, but I didn't like having to drag legless torsos out of the water because the water turned out to be corrosive acid. I only wished that was an exaggeration. People who messed up sometimes came home in sandwich baggies. I'd once asked the man who was training me, "Why do these things do this to us?" He had just offered a gruff laugh and said, "Why do the stars shine? It's just what they do. These things hate Ed. It's just what they do." At the time, I'd had it in my head to tell him that the stars shine because they had at some point, billions of years ago, been in the throes of nuclear fusion, and now that light was reaching us. But I kept my mouth shut instead. I'm glad I did. The years since have given me some clarity on the matter, and frankly, my snide thought, while accurate, completely missed the point. We couldn't understand what the things from the anomalies wanted. It's impossible to fathom the thoughts of things that exist in spaces that go between the fabric of one reality and another. You just need to know that part of their existence is an animosity towards humanity that knows no bounds. There was no pleading with them, no making sense of their actions or the ways of their world. The only thing we could do was try and understand how to keep them away from us. The most frightening aspect of these phenomena were the connections. It didn't happen all the time, but occasionally we would discover strands of continuity between the different sites, repeated symbols, sightings of similar figures, direct references to other sites. It was troubling to say the least. It implied some type of organization in the madness, and that was a horror that kept me up some nights. The van pulled to a stop. "I want monitoring and command set up inside the hour." William was up already, opening the back of the van and giving us our first look at the house. I looked up at the place, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something up on the roof looking back down at me, but then I squinted and saw that it was just some kind of antenna. It was bent, and there was something hanging from it, but it was difficult to see from where I was. "Get our sat link up and connected. We're going to try and run live updates on this one," William ordered. I winced but kept it to myself. The satellite uplink system was garbage. We were piggybacking on an old high-altitude systems that were already stressed with other business. Even with a solid connection to the satellite, which was iffy, keeping a consistent uplink speed was nearly impossible. Still, this was my job, so I'd do what I could. The equipment was in black cases, and as soon as the floor panels were down, I got to unpacking and setting things up immediately. Some of the others were starting to assemble the tent over the top of us. Once command was up, I ran the dish outside and began trying to get a fix on our satellite. I used a compass to get the coordinates and waited for the connection to come up. It didn't. I tried a few more times and then, with a frustrated sigh, moved on to my next task. "I'm ready to go in," I told William, collecting the boxes of equipment I needed for surveillance. I hated this part of the job. Entering anomalous sites was always dangerous. It had been years since we had proven that these locations drew energy from living beings within their sphere of influence. Not only did it slowly sap those who entered, but it began working on you immediately, distorting your thoughts and reasoning. We still hadn't determined if this was some kind of targeted attack or if it was just a natural effect that anomalies had on human minds and bodies. I was inclined to believe it was intentional. Once you had felt the sinister touch of these otherworldly manifestations, it became increasingly difficult not to sense a dark intent. Either way, certain drugs could be used to ease the effect on your mind. They were addictive and not great for your health, so we generally reserved them for more dangerous situations. Shauna and Chip followed me as I moved towards the door of the home. The steps up onto the small front stoop were shallow, but I took them slow anyway. Going into a place that was being twisted by an anomaly often felt unpleasant. Sometimes your stomach would lurch, or you'd feel a wave of depression and worry. But I didn't get that as I moved closer to the door. At least no more than I already felt it. And that was likely just jitters. As I stepped towards the door, it swung open on its own, far too fast to have been drawn by the wind, and the door was supposed to be locked. "Fucking great," Chip sighed. "I love it when they start messing with you right away." I reached out and opened the screen door, sliding the lock on the hinge into place so it would stay open. The main door was wide open now. I switched on the flashlight attached to my vest and spilled the glow of warmed LED light across the entryway. The door opened into a hall with stairs along one side and rooms to either side. Looking back through the house, I could see the kitchen at the far end. The place was still furnished, left exactly as it had been on the last day it had held people. Apparently no one wanted to come back for the furniture. Smart folks. I stepped inside, expecting to feel something on crossing the threshold into Anomaly space, but there was nothing. I frowned, surprised by such a lackluster entrance from a place that had opened its own door for me. It was almost worse to have things inside the home so quiet after that little bit of theatrics with the door. Either way, it didn't matter. The equipment needed to set up, and that was my job. I began to place the first sensor suite in the hall. All of the equipment I needed to get in place at each location was in a case no larger than a toaster. There were remote modules that I would deploy as well, but those were about the size of a wallet and went up easily. The main units took a little more work and some consideration of placement, since I wanted to make sure none of the enclosed instruments would be in a place where there was interference. The hall was easy. One main unit, 2 remotes. I moved to the next room. A layer of dust had settled over everything, but otherwise things looked normal. This could have been anyone's house, but for the smell of long-term vacancy and something else. Something sweet and cloying. I knew the smell. It was associated with anomalies. My 2 armed escorts were scanning nearby doors and making sure nothing was hiding behind the furniture, and I went about setting up the next group of modules. I was constantly aware that something could happen at any moment, but I finished all of the downstairs with not so much as a wayward creak of floorboards. I hope this place turns out to be just another regular spooky house. I'm not up for a repeat of my last job. Shauna spoke quietly as we moved up the stairs. I put another portable module that would sync up with the hall sensor on the wall. You thinking of retiring? Chip asked her. Every single job, I swear, she answered, and we all laughed a little. This job was a nightmare in almost literal sense, but there was also something that drew you back to the work. Once you knew the darkness was full of monsters, it could be really difficult to turn your back on it anymore. You couldn't switch the knowledge off. Oh shit, it's him. Shauna's voice made me turn her way. She was looking at a painting hanging to one side of the landing. It looked like something that had been bought at the estate sale of a castle in Germany. It was a portrait of a pale man with an awful smile on his face. He was showing just a little of his teeth, but they seemed to be sharp between his lips, and those thin gray lips were too wide on his face. It looked like if he opened his mouth as wide as he could, it would tip the top of his head all the way back to his neck, like he had the hinged jaws of a snake. The eyes were black from pupil to sclera. His outfit was all dark tones and a formal cut, like the finery a medieval king might have worn. The background of the picture was covered in details that I couldn't make out, but they looked meticulous, penned in lines so tiny I could barely differentiate them. I reached up and thumbed my radio. Command, we have a confirmed sighting of the Uncanny Man. There is a painting to the left of the stairs on the second floor with a depiction of him. Is this on any of the inventories? One moment, a voice responded. Rick, I thought. I made sure my body cam was pointed at the picture, but I found myself not wanting to look into those black eyes anymore. The Uncanny Man was a repeating anomalous entity. He wasn't always at the site of an anomaly, but he appeared enough that we'd been taught to look out for him. He was usually seen at more dangerous locations. Now there are no paintings in the house. We have video confirmation of your sighting from your body cams. Proceed carefully. I'm moving the site status to hot active. Start level 2 precautions. Finish up quickly. William's reply was exactly what I had suspected. All of us opened a small tin case in one of the many pockets of our vests and pulled out a prepped syringe. I removed the cap on mine, pressed the needle until a tiny bit of liquid came out. I uncovered the port on my chest and injected the methylphenidate as the others did the same. The sharpened focus came on quickly, as well as that unnatural sense of clarity that made every color a little brighter and every edge a little harder. The other two switched their weapons from single fire to burst fire and released their safeties. We were now hyper alert and extra dangerous, yet that meant almost nothing if things went really wrong. We began to move from room to room, setting up the equipment. The other two were on high alert, and that allowed me to really focus my attention on what I was doing. In fact, with the drugs running through my system, I was almost hyper-fixated on the sensors as I put them up, which is probably why I noticed something strange. The temperature's getting colder as we get nearer to the master bedroom. I said the words out loud. It was strange that Command hadn't bothered to tell us when they got the readings. How much colder? Chip asked. 12 degrees from the first room on the left side to this room here. This was the third room. It did feel a bit cooler on my face now that I thought about it. The suits we wore helped regulate body temperatures, but they didn't cover our faces or our hands. The first case took place in that room, didn't it? Shauna dipped her gun in the direction we were headed. I nodded my reply as we headed out of the room we were working in and made our way towards the master bedroom. Shauna went in first, called that the room was clear, and then Chip and I followed her. The room was empty. There wasn't so much as a single nightstand in place. I deployed my equipment quickly, finding the cool air in the room to be unsettling. I switched on the main unit once it was ready, waited for the lights to say we were all connected, and then got up. Okay, let's... I stopped mid-sentence. Chip was standing by the door looking down the hall. Shauna wasn't in the room. Where's Shauna? I asked, expecting Chip to tell me she went ahead to clear our way, but Chip turned back to the room and I saw him start in surprise as he realized the room was empty but for the two of us and the equipment. She should be right here. I just looked away from her. I turned to look out the door, but she was standing right there by the wall." He gestured to one side of the room, next to a closet door. "Shauna?" I called towards the closet. There was no reply, but I hadn't anticipated there would be one. I felt a terrible chill go up my spine, and it had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Chip walked over to the door slowly, keeping his gun trained on it. He reached out, taking the handle firmly in his grip, looked at me, then looked back at the door. He threw it open and brought his weapon up, barrel pointed inside. It was empty. On the back wall of the closet, someone had painted a large spiral with a diamond-shaped head at the outer edge of its winding path. It looked like a snake or a flatworm. I'd seen the symbol before, but no one was sure what it meant. The radio beeped. "Shauna is gone." William's voice had a strained timbre to it. Chip responded quickly. "We've lost visual on Shauna. She has been vanished." There was a short pause, and when William came back on, "Copy. Return to command." "Copy," Chip replied, and then we were rushing for the exit. Chip was in front, scanning the area with eyes that were hyper-alert. I was not far behind him. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see either Shauna or whatever had taken her away. There was nothing. We crossed the threshold of the door, leaving it open in case Shauna did come after us. I unstopped the screen door and let that fall closed at our back, feeling like I needed to at least put something between us and the house. Once outside, we turned our attention to the van and the command tent, and that was when things became even worse. The tent was destroyed, but the bodies of our friends were skewered on the heavy corner posts as though something huge had picked them up and slammed them face first onto the stakes. The sight of it made every part of me recoil in horror. I felt sick. How had this happened? Anomalies didn't spread outside of their confines. I'd been on enough missions to know when I should be safe, and I should have been safe out on that front lawn. But clearly I wasn't. "What the hell's going on?" Chip's voice sounded as strained as I felt. "You can't leave it. Once it knows you exist, it will never let you go." The voice from behind us had me spinning on my heels. There was a man standing just inside the door. It took me a moment to figure out who he was because I'd only ever seen him in pictures, and the pictures I had seen had been of a very different version of this man. The one before me was covered in scars, as though his whole body had been dragged over a field of razor blades. The skin on his back had been cut into strips and then stretched and hung on bits of iron rods that were twisted into his neck and shoulders, spreading them open like flesh wings that rose just above his head. "Mr. Jones, why don't you come out here and we'll get in the van and we can take you to a hospital, get you some help." How I managed to sound calm was a miracle. James laughed and started backing back into the house. "No, they've had enough of me for now. It's your turn. I'm sorry. You shouldn't have come here." Chip was already at the van with the sat phone. I could see the dead signal light on the side of the device, but Chip was clearly planning on leaving a repeating message. "Gatehouse, this is Site 147. We have multiple team members down in our starting evac. Repeat, multiple team members down. Evac in process." I turned and started to head for the driver's side of the van. We needed to leave immediately. The mission was awash. If the anomaly had spread beyond the house, then there was no telling where the actual border was. I was most of the way around the van when a man in black finery stepped out from behind the vehicle, and I drew up short. "Oh, no, 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 no." His voice was smooth and deep. "You can't just leave without meeting your host." The uncanny man's eyes were so dark that I felt like I was falling into them as I met his gaze, as though everything was falling into them, and it hurt. I had never known that fear could hit a person so hard. My entire body felt numb with it. I thought I might drop dead. I almost wanted to. I heard the sound of a burst of automatic fire from behind me. It startled me back to clarity for a moment, and I looked that way, expecting to see Chip taking up aim on the horror in front of me. But instead, I turned to see Chip crumpling to the ground with most of his head missing. The weak ones are no fun. That smooth voice crept into my ears again, and I turned back. It was closer now, smiling with a grin that was terrible and wide. There were so many teeth. It was hungry. So hungry. You aren't weak, are you? Let's go meet the king. The worm is famished. It reached out for me, and reality splintered with my mind. I hope you enjoyed both tales, The Lost, The Cave, and The Closet, as well as Anomaly, written by Heath Pfaff and performed by yours truly, Paul J. McSorley. To find more from Heath Pfaff, please visit simplyscarypodcast.com/Pfaff, spelled Pfaff, and you'll be redirected to his author profile on our horror fiction website, creepypastastories.com, where you'll find ways to follow him on his website of foxesmind.com. That's OFFOXSMIND.com, as well as a link to his work on Amazon.com by clicking his Amazon link on that profile. A small portion of your purchase goes to us here at Chilling Tales, where we are proud Amazon affiliates, to help make this show possible. If you enjoyed tonight's story, hosted by yours truly, Paul J. McSorley, you can search my name on Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on YouTube for additional previous stories. If you'd like to hear more lengthy tales, be sure to take a look at my audiobooks. Available now on audible.com, or just visit paulsbooks.net. That's PAULSBOOKS.net. You can also find me personally on Facebook and Twitter. And with that, listeners, our weekly journey into the psyche has just about come to a close. But before we go, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for joining us for tonight's episode, and remind you to take a moment to stop by our iTunes page and leave Chilling Tales for Dark Nights a 5-star review and a kind word. And follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram if you haven't already. And of course, subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can find an archive of our work going back to 2012. And consider signing up as a patron at our website, chillingtalesfordarknights.com, to show your support and get all of our content ad-free. I'm your host for Fear from the Heartland, Paul J. McSorley. I've enjoyed the titillation tonight. Ooh, there's that word again. Thank you for joining me. Hope to see you again next week at Fear from the Heartland.
Chilling Tales for Dark